Hey, it's so good to see everyone. Today is Father's Day, as you know, and so there's just a chance to celebrate as a family the institution of fatherhood. But today's message is about much more than fatherhood. And in fact, we get to continue in our study of Ruth and conclude our study. We were going to conclude next Sunday, but of course, George and Pam will be here, and so today's the conclusion. If you wouldn't mind having a Bible out in front of you as we go through this, I would love that. It's a good habit to have. Bring a Bible, make some notes in there as we go through. And I'd like to open in prayer. Jesus, we're so thankful that you are the one that enables us to have families and to be a part of families and to take up responsibilities and privileges in our relationships. God, I pray that you would teach us today how we are to walk forward in our lives, how we are to act in a godly way, how we are to follow your Son's example in Jesus. Teach us, God, how we are to lead by example. And through this message, Lord, I pray that we would be transformed through your word. Amen. The message today is out of Ruth Chapter 4. You'll see in the note sheet that there's a title, God Calls Me to a New Role. You'll see online that the title says, God Calls Me to Lead. The truth is, I don't have a title yet that I feel comfortable with, happy with, and so if you have a title later, please feel free to tell me. Think about some times in life when you have found yourself playing a certain role with other people. You know, that's actually something we do all the time. On the playground growing up, I remember thinking, oh, she's the risk taker. And he's the guy who makes a joke out of everything. And she's the quiet one, and he's the teacher's pet, and so on. So I know that you have seen this, grew up this. There's always categories, roles that you see people playing. And so have you recognized when you adopted or received a role from others that you then played? For myself, I would have to say, as a kid, I adopted the steady, quiet role. No one is surprised. No one is surprised. So I felt the impulse to just not speak up. I felt no need at all to say anything, generally, unless I was asked questions by others. In fact, I said, I'm comfortable doing my work in the background and letting all the other kids encounter the consequences of their poor actions. Did anyone else play that role? I certainly played that for a lot of years. And so the question I would ask here is, were those roles, whether you adopted them yourself or whether you kind of received them from others, were they good for you? Are there ways in which they were not good for you also? I think sometimes both are true. My parents took us to church when I was little, grew up in a church, and some of the risk taker kids that were my age liked to explore back rooms in the church when no one was looking. And one time a bunch of them went up an old stairwell into the attic of the church, which was above the sanctuary, like this, 20-foot high sanctuary, and they walked in the attic across the rafters. And one of the church elders told me later that he'd found footsteps in the dust on the rafters, but not only there, but sometimes down through the insulation and on the sheetrock. Now, those of you who know how sheetrock works, back then the boards were just nailed up to the underside of the rafters with these little nails. So you probably recognize that kid almost broke through and killed himself. That's the cost of embracing an identity that you don't know anything about. Being a risk taker but not having the wisdom to go with it. So I think in some ways roles cannot be good for us, and they can box us into places where we actually in the long run should not be. Sometimes it's good to embrace a role, though. When I was with that same group of kids, and there were a couple risk takers in that group, one year, I really don't remember this scenario, I just remember the location in a hallway in a church. They were up to something no good, and an adult walked up and said, "Hey, what's going on?" I was about to participate, so I'm, just following along. And in that moment, again, honestly, I don't remember what they were doing. But in that moment, I made a life-changing decision. And I decided that I would not learn anything the hard way again. I would embrace, this is what I decided, I would embrace every ounce of sensible advice that somebody older than me gave. And I would learn it right up front and go into situations ready in the future. I didn't like bad consequences. And so it turns out that's actually pretty good advice. That's a decent role to play because you actually do learn things before you need to know them. People see you as being wiser. It just helps. And so it has served me ever since. Now, I'm not oppositional to rules, and I'm not in favor of rules. I just know I like to learn why certain rules are there and why the wisdom is there, and I want to learn it. And so in that moment, I made the decision I'm going to learn it up front. And I haven't ever fallen through a sheetrock roof. So what kind of roles do you adopt today? Today, not just back then when you were a kid, but today. One way that your default roles or maybe your personality box you in and harm you, just one way, is that we often actually don't grow until we are called into new roles and new levels of responsibility. For example, how did I, the quiet, let them suffer personality, leave them to their own consequences kind of a kid, how did I become a pastor? It's no secret. This is no secret. When I am affirmed by others in times of affirmation over the past 20 or 30 years, it's not because I'm the quiet, steady one, distant because I'm staying away from the action. The affirmations are because I'm an intentional, thoughtful person engaged in relationships and in conversation and caregiving toward others. It may be in a quieter mode, but I'm intentionally engaged, which is not the role that I played when I was a kid. Not silent, but well-spoken. And so I didn't get that way because I stayed in that role, but because multiple people over many years called me out of it and gave me challenges and said, do some uncomfortable things that will cause you to grow. And sometimes they didn't even tell me it would cause me to grow. They just gave me uncomfortable things to do, and I grew into the new role. Sometimes we get boxed in and we don't realize we have to step out of the roles we've either been assigned or that we are living out by default. Are the roles you play helpful? Are they good? Are they even necessary for you to play? And what would God call you to do? So today we're going to see some roles played out. As I mentioned a couple weeks ago, the book of Ruth is profoundly useful for men and women to understand manhood and womanhood. And that seems especially appropriate here on Father's Day, not just for fathers, but for people of all kinds. So we're going to learn from four characters. As you know, we have Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz. And today there's a new person, an anonymous person, in Ruth Chapter 4. So let's read together. We're going to read the entire chapter of Ruth 4, if you'd pull that out. And if you don't have a Bible, just reach in front in the seats and you can grab one there. Okay, brief context. Let's just remember Boaz has just agreed to take on the responsibility of marrying Ruth, who is without family now. She's widowed, has no security, no source of income, no children, no source of financial provision. And Boaz has agreed to say, I will do something about that. So in verse 1, Meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town gate and sat there just as the guardian redeemer, or King James it's called the kinsman redeemer, he had mentioned, came along. Let's just remember the guardian redeemer, kinsman redeemer is a close family member, the closest family member who cares for a widow in their extended family. Boaz said, "Come over here, my friend, and sit down." And so he sat down. Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, "Sit here," and they did so too. Then he said to the guardian redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech." That was Naomi's husband, who's now dead. "I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of those seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. And if you'll redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me so I will know, for no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line." So let me just note briefly, the mother, Naomi, who was married to Elimelech, who's passed away, had property with her husband and their family, their 2 sons, who are also now dead. So she had property, and this is about the property and what she's trying to do with it. There's a family property, but there's no men to work the land. This is what the guardian redeemer says, "I will redeem it." Then Boaz said, "On the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite." That's the country next door. "The dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property." At this, the guardian redeemer said, "Then I cannot redeem it, because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it." Now, in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to be final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. So the guardian redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it yourself." And he removed his sandal. Then Boaz announced to all the elders and all the people, "Today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech and the 2 sons, Chilion and Mahlon." Now, just keep in mind here, this is a little bit like going to the title company today. When you buy a house, some of you have done that. You go to the title company and you sign 500 forms. And they try to explain in 2 sentences what this entire page is, and then you sign it and you just keep rolling on and saying, "Lord, I hope they know what they're asking me to sign." Okay? Back then, they just did this with the collective memory of all the town elders. So the town elders were the title company. Yes, so-and-so agreed to exchange this property and redeem this property and all that. This is the arrangement that's going on right now. And then Boaz says, "I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. Today you are witnesses." Then the elders and all the people at the gate said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home," that's Ruth, "like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. And through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah." We're talking about their ancestors here and the carrying on of a lineage. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And when he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he be famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Then Naomi took the child in her arm and cared for him. And the women living there said, "Naomi has a son." And they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. And then there's the family line in verse 18 through 22. So let's ask some clarifying questions. I have three. The first one is this: what does it mean to redeem property? We're not used to that idea that, we just sell property from one person to the next to the next. There's no idea of somebody coming back in and redeeming it back for themselves, but that's what happens here. And so for that, we look back to the Old Testament law in the book of Leviticus. You could find this in chapter 25 of Leviticus. And here's an example. If one of your fellow Israelites becomes poor and sells some of their property, their nearest relative is to come and redeem what they have sold. So basically, the original family can come and purchase the property back and claim it back. So the property, over the long term, over generations, remains within the family. It doesn't get dispersed in other families, other clans own it. But it stays within the clan because you have the right to come back and redeem it back into your clan. The second question I have is, what does it mean to redeem Ruth? That's an interesting question. It is, as I said a couple weeks ago, it is our goal just to understand their culture. It's not our culture today, but we want to understand it, not to adopt what they did, nor to reject it, but just to understand it so we know what the Lord can say to us today. So it is strange that Ruth would be, quote unquote, acquired along with the property. But this is nothing like a form of chattel slavery or even servanthood like has happened over centuries across the world. It isn't like either of those things. If you're looking for examples to understand it, I might call forth the idea of what a tenant farmer is back in medieval Europe as an example. Somebody who lives on your land, and you give them the right to live on your land. You don't own those that live on the land, nor do you tell them what to do when you're the lord of the manor. The tenants do their own business. But your job as the lord of the land is to care for anyone who inhabits your land. Your job is to care for them. They can move elsewhere if they want to, but when they're under your protection, you're the one who provides and makes sure that the enemy stay far away and that there's services that the village has to keep it going. Today, if you buy a house that is a rental when you first buy it, you still need to care for the existing renters. That's another example today. They're not yours, they're not slaves, they're not servants, but they're under a caregiving contract of some kind, which imposes upon you, the owner, some responsibility. Another example might be just what it meant to be a patriarch of a large clan maybe in the old world in Europe, or you go to Italy or some other places around the world, really. And when you're the patriarch of the family, I mean, everybody does their own thing, but it's your obligation, your responsibility as a patriarch, or if it's a matriarchal society as well, to ensure the sustenance and the well-being of everybody under your care. The responsibility here for the kinsman redeemer is to physically care for and further the family line of that person. Boaz is to father children with Ruth, marrying her, fathering children with her, whose named father will not be Boaz, but will be her first husband. His job is to come in and ensure that she is taken care of and her family line continues. And that is quite a responsibility. The third question I have is this: what is happening exactly when Boaz asks the relative to be the redeemer? Now, it does say that the relative is the one closest to Ruth in relationship. I would guess he's actually the brother-in-law. And Boaz is a step further distant in the family tree. Well, I'd like to read a passage from Deuteronomy 25, again in the Old Testament law, that I think you will find very fascinating. So listen carefully here. Okay, Deuteronomy 25:7 says, if a man does not want to marry his brother's wife when she has been widowed, she shall go to the elders at the town gate and say, my husband's brother refuses to carry on his brother's name. He will not fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to me. Then the elders of the town will summon the brother-in-law and talk to him. And if he persists in saying, I do not want to marry her, the widow shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, take off one of his sandals, spit in his face, and say, this is what is done to the man who will not build up his brother's family line. So this passage in Deuteronomy speaks about shame and dishonor for someone who does not fulfill their family role to care for those in their extended family when they're the one whose job it is to do so. Not taking responsibility. And so if you're putting two and two together here, this was Naomi's right. Naomi could have gone up to her brother-in-law and said, dishonor on you, and taken away his ability, taking the sandal, taking away the ability for him to own the property, and shaming him in front of all of the elders of the town and the people of the town. But what is the focus of the story? I mean, we don't pick up any of that shame in this moment, do we? What is the focus? It is on the extra generosity and the honor given by Boaz to Ruth and Naomi. Boaz, who's not the closest relative. Boaz, who's not the kinsman redeemer yet. Who's not the one to take responsibility and has no need to go out of his way to do any of this. That's the clear lesson that we need to pick up here, is the focus is on the one who does what is good and right and goes out of his way. There's a structure here which we've talked about in previous weeks, where there's always a central moment in each story. And so that central moment here in Ruth Chapter 4 starts with verse 4 and goes through verse 8. In verse 4, Boaz says, will you redeem Ruth and this land? And then in verse 6, the closest relative says, no, I cannot. You do it. And then in verse 8, Boaz says, then I will redeem it. So right in the middle there, we have this transfer of responsibility. And the shame is not brought up to the forefront, but the honor of Boaz is what's brought up to the forefront. The relative says, no, I can't do it. And Boaz says, then I will. That's what we're supposed to notice. That's where God's honoring is headed, is to Boaz. What role does the nearest relative play here? If you're just going to talk about what kind of role does he play, well, I would call it self-preservation, perhaps. Limited participation. I mean, what does he say? That would endanger my own estate. What basically means if I marry Ruth and I have a child by her who's our heir, he will be the heir of Ruth's family and not my heir, and I'm afraid that I won't have my own heir. And so it's a self-preservation role. I need to keep limited participation here. He doesn't want to do it. It was his responsibility to, but he backs away from it. But what role does Boaz play? Well, he plays a role that he wasn't quite yet obligated to do. He steps up. He plays the role of the real leader of the clan, of the real patriarch in this case. He's somebody who takes extra initiative for someone else in need. He cares outside of his own circle. He's not pointing out the wrongs of others. And I think that's very important here. Boaz doesn't say anything. He just honorably steps up and takes the responsibility. He strategically does what is right and good. And that's the lesson that this story celebrates. It celebrates maturity. It celebrates honorable action outside of our own borders. Now, there's many other lessons in the book of Ruth, which we may have gotten to next week. As you know, one lesson is about Naomi, and she is bitter, but she follows through with faithfulness to Ruth, and she is rewarded by the Lord in the end. And Ruth has enormous faithfulness and boldness, and that, when she's in a place of need, is also rewarded. And then, of course, there's the lesson of the family relative, who is basically anonymous because he disappears into the background, because he decides not to step up to the plate, so to speak. To use a modern metaphor, he doesn't step up and swing for the bat. Today especially, being Father's Day, is a day when I think we can reflect on the character qualities that matter. And so I would like us to consider the fourth person, Boaz, and aspire to what we see in him and why God brings blessing to those qualities, and aspire to those qualities. I'm going to draw out 4 godly qualities that I think we can see in Boaz. They're just highlighted right in front of us. The first one is you have to be willing to take initiative beyond yourself. That's what he does. In fact, I would want to ask, what are the ways that initiative outside of yourself actually glorifies God? It brings God glory. For many years, I've worked on the campus with college students. And there are always situations, certain moments, where I might be, observant of character and how people respond in certain moments. Like I've got to move some heavy furniture, or I'm setting up something on campus. And there's some students will jump up and say, "Hey, can I help? That looks heavy." Other students will just pay no attention. You're on campus. Sometimes that just happens. Or sometimes there's maybe a parent and a new student who shows up on campus, and I want to introduce them to a few people that I know. And some people come over and say, "Well, I want to, how can I make you at home? You're my guest here on campus." And others will continue to go about their own business. There's different ways that we can see a situation and step up and take initiative. And there's other ways in which we can simply continue to go about our own business. How can you take care of people in the room? Strangers or friends? How can you take care of neighbors? People you run across, or when you walk into a meeting? Do you look around and say, "Hey, there's somebody that looks like they could use some attention," or looks like they could use a conversation, or is there a way I can help? How do you, in those moments, see people around you? I would ask you, in every setting you walk into, find ways to take initiative beyond yourself. See who's in need. Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan, which is a really classic example of going beyond your means, going beyond your circle to do something that nobody expects, but you do it anyway because the Lord's love motivates you, and that sense of honor and responsibility pushes you forward. A second quality we can aspire to is that we need to learn how to give honor to those around us. So there's a moment where Boaz and Naomi could expose the shame of their family relative. They could call it out, and that passage in Deuteronomy is pretty powerful because I just can't imagine what it would be like to have somebody publicly spit in my face and bring that level of shame to me. We're not used to seeing that, but it was their right, and yet they don't walk in that path. They don't make that choice. Instead, Boaz and Naomi simply move forward in giving honor. Boaz quietly says, "Well, great. I will redeem it." It's understated, it's subtle, and it's powerful. He gives honor. He doesn't expose shame. Are there ways that you can adjust your language toward others around you, settings that you're in, family and friends and strangers even, where in your language and in your actions, you focus honor on others? You do what's necessary to keep people from being exposed or shamed, but help them to see goodness in the moment. A third lesson that I would take from this, a character quality, is learning how to give protection and favor to others. For Boaz, as we learned this, I think it was last week from Rebecca, one of the things he did in his fields, when he had the workers farming in his fields, is he made space in the fields for somebody who didn't normally come and show up. And that was Ruth. You know, often the women who wanted to glean from the fields would do so later and pick up what was, what was minimally left behind. But Boaz made sure that she actually came during the regular workday and got all the corners and was able to glean at the same time as his regular workers. He gave her ample opportunity to be supplied in her financial need, to be secure. And he went out of his way to create a protected space for her by telling his workers, don't harm her. He went out of his way to do that. What are ways in which we can protect those around us and give favor to them above and beyond? And number 4, I would just describe it as this: doing what is right and good. Sometimes we know what's right. We know it's not necessarily up to us to do it, but we see that something needs to be done. What is good to be done? And this is what God desires in all of us, that we do what is right and good. What does God celebrate in the moment? What would he celebrate? What kind of actions would he say, thank you so much for knowing my heart and following through with it? God calls us to eagerly exercise our responsibilities and to step up to new responsibilities whenever we understand that there's more that could be done. I think, to be honest, just like the moments when I was, probably 8 years old, until now, I think we all grow in our understanding of what needs to be done. It's not like we understand all that when we're a kid. And we say, oh, there's somebody in need, I should go talk to them, or that person needs help in this way, or we don't always see that. We grow into that in our teens and 20s and onwards. So when you see a new arena that's yours to grow in, I would suggest dive in and own it. Say, okay, God, I've never thought that I should do this kind of thing before, but from now on I am. I'm going to live that way. What are the ways in which your roles in life can become these things? Taking initiative beyond yourself, giving honor to those around you, giving protection and favor, and doing what is right and good. From the roles you play right now in every setting with all the people you know, what are the ways in which those roles can become these? How can we grow? I think finally, I want to say a few words to our fathers. We do have some actual fathers in the room, and so I want to celebrate them today. In particular, as you think about Boaz, and you think about the family environment that we're reading about in Ruth, there's some things that come to my mind. I think it's pretty powerful that you see the lineage of Boaz and Ruth's son, Obed, that it actually becomes the lineage of salvation. From them came the line of David, the king of Israel, who was the model that Jesus follows after, and then Jesus assumes that kingship when he himself lives on the earth. And there's quite a lineage of salvation that comes from the actions of Boaz. So that leads me to these thoughts. One is this: think about your own family, fathers. Children require years of dedicated attention. I mean dedicated attention, far beyond the amount of energy you ever gave to any other human being in your life. They require reading out loud and physical play and taking them on spiritual outings and giving guidance and finding small and large ways to faithfully love your family behind the scenes and your children behind the scenes even when they don't know it? Are you modeling an honoring, caring life with your children? And in these ways, well, in the ways that were on the screen a minute ago. There's quite a powerful influence that fathers have on the spiritual direction of their family. There was a bunch of years where we had an organization, I think it still exists, called Promise Keepers, which was all about calling men back to God-honoring roles in the home. And they did some surveys from time to time. This was a very powerful one for me. If a father does not go to church, participate in the community of Christ, even if his spouse, his wife, does, only one child in 50 will become a regular worshiper and follower of Jesus. That's 2% of all children, because the father has this influence. But if a father does participate consistently in the family of God, in the church, 75% of their children will follow Jesus in years following. Just think about that enormous difference and power that you can exercise. Are you exercising your influence? I think I'll have the worship team come up at this point. I'd like to read some verses to our fathers and the ideas that these verses bring to fatherhood. I'm going to place them up on the screen here. Think about Joshua 24, which says, it's 24. Choose for yourself this day whom you will serve, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And that is the idea of bringing spiritual direction, decisive direction, and making God the Lord of your home. In Proverbs 3:11, it says, do not despise the Lord's discipline, because the Lord disciplines those he loves, as a father disciplines the son he delights in. That is the idea that careful discipline, combined with delight, produces good life habits for our children and our families. Ephesians 6:4 says, fathers, don't exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and the instruction of the Lord. That is the idea of being careful with our words and actions as fathers. Our words and actions impact our children. And it's about the idea of being a coach and a teacher and a trainer in godliness. Psalm 103:13 says, as a father has compassion on his own children, so the Lord has compassion on those who fear him. That's the idea of compassion and grace for others, which should abound in all of our parents, especially fathers. And finally, I want to read Ephesians 5:25. It's a section 5:25 through 37. One section of it says, husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave up his life for her, to make her holy. That is the idea that husbands coming into the home give sacrificially and bring purity and spiritual health into their home by way of sacrifice. Now, let's go back to the first one. Becky, if that's all right. Yeah, right there. I think most of these things that we see are skills and attitudes that ought to be practiced by mothers as well as fathers. And let's go back one more to that one that had the summary of all four right here. Wives as well as husbands should live this way. And so I'm not going to make tight distinctions here between men's roles and women's roles. I think we go astray too far when we try to play that game too tightly. These are godly traits that Boaz exercised. They're definitely husbandly, fatherly traits, but they are actually traits for every human being, including wives. So I would say, I'd ask us this question: when is a man fulfilling his role? Whether a man is single, or a husband and a father. And so here is where I think the baseline is. It is when we see a man acting in a godly way. Then we would say that is a father acting in his role. And when is a woman fulfilling her role, whether single or as a wife and a mother? That is when we see a woman acting in a godly way. So today I call us to step into our God-given roles. Let's do it. Let's aspire to lead ourselves toward God-given traits, to initiate, to help, to protect, to care, to provide for those around us in a way that honors God and honors them. I conclude with this phrase here, and that's in Philippians chapter 2. And then we're going to pray. Thanks, team. It says in Philippians chapter 2 about Jesus, who Jesus, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. He made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And Jesus humbled himself as a man and became obedient to death, even to death on a cross. And therefore God exalted him to the highest place. This passage starts with the phrase, in your relationships with others. In your relationships with others, act as Jesus did, which is think of yourself as a servant and step forward and become obedient even to death. For the sake of others, in your relationship with others, give of yourself. And so I call us to that today. What is the God-given roles that you should step into today? And I invite you, as we sing this next couple songs, to actually write down a role or two that you want to say, yes, I'm going to step into that role today and this year. Jesus, we thank you that you watch over us and that you have modeled for us the kind of life you want us to live. Thank you, Jesus, for modeling for us. Thank you for this word and the scripture today where we see another model in Boaz, the people around him. We see a model of what it means to extend outside your borders and to do what is honorable, good, and right. God, help us to find that deep within ourselves as well. Help us to dig through that, the pieces of our life and say, I'm going to grow right now in this way. In Jesus' name, we delight in you, Lord. Amen.